Wim Wenders has depicted contemporary societies as refined aesthetic ecosystems before both the isolated rural corners of America and the West, German ambitions to compose a perfect, pure modernity in a convicted contrast to their earlier half of the 20th century. Wenders' America was immediately considered the ultimate of the road movie cycle, topping Hopper and Hellman by depicting it at its most potent, as an immigrant's, an outsider turned hopeful resident's, paradise. The accustomed idealism, rooted in a firmly American post-Constitution, post-flag tradition manifested in Easy Rider, was cleaned of blind patriotism for two-lane blacktop and then reconsidered as a philosophic idealism of the German kind, of the post-Kantian kind specifically. Wenders' more recent fictional features have been arguably uncaptivating, or I could anyway. His three most noted and most impressive and compelling 2010s or 21st century works have been the documentaries Pina, previously discussed on FOTD, Salt of the Earth, and Pope Francis, A Man of His Word. Why has Wenders hesitated to observe the contemporary societal unit as a fiction or beyond the lens of one individual ethos, a dance theorist, a photographer, and a pope, respectively? Because arguably 1991's Until the End of the World was a firm apotheosis of this exploration, a work Wenders filmed in 5 months in 15 cities in 8 countries on 4 continents, and now feels compelled to explore modernity in such a manner again, at a surface level more minimally, stylistically, aesthetically, although manipulating the medium itself. Does Wenders with Perfect Days compose a recording of the present in front of the frame and a philosophic distillation of the present's pathos via the medium of the frame itself. Perfect Days' mode of symmetrical, sentimental, contemplative, and slow-moving art house / film festival cinema is as aged and time-eroded so as to be a biblical parable, a Shakespearean tragedy, or post-war nihilist noir. And like a postmodern rejuvenation, hip, slick, and 90s, Wenders revives the mode as a vessel to navigate the contemporary from a familiar scaffold. Japan has been so fetishized by the Western world as to render the charge of Orientalist almost an exasperated, defeated gasp. As Werner Herzog learned in 2019, a Western filmmaker realizing Japan aesthetically can result in cries of appropriation and otherization, at least if the transcribed screeching on Letterboxd or Twitter X is to be considered coherent language. Abbas Kiarostami previously explored this in 2012 for Like Someone in Love, and was celebrated, although he's more arguably not a Western filmmaker. I have yet to view Herzog's Family Romance LLC despite my reverence for that champion, though I'm a very firm admirer of Like Someone in Love, and Kiarostami in general, and where Perfect Days might go one further than Kiarostami is the removal of imposed sentiment. Perfect Days will be perceived as sentimental, may have been perceived as sentimental, but is equally nihilistic, whether Wenders deemed it so or not. Make no mistake, Perfect Days is about a conditioned man, an effectively trained dog who loves his role and contribution and small freedoms rather than the prized notion of choice and personal liberation. It will be abhorred by the prospective revolutionaries, adored by the ascetic spiritualists, embraced though condescendingly sneered at from ideological capitalists, and an object of emotional masturbation from the self-interested, sensation-gorging film enthusiasts. I try not to be the latter in my pathology, despite it dominating much of my actions. The other side of a coin deglazes the zone of interest. Wenders' Perfect Days finds a solace in now modernity. Both display a familiar, comforting style, symmetrical, satiating, clean chrome, Apple ad idealism, familiar to anyone who has been to film festivals in the 2010s and on. Films employ this style, or quasi-documentary, slightly shaky cam, or rip-off Angelopoulos again and again and again and again and again. Both films utilize said style to enunciate a deeper, truthful expression of our shared aesthetic modernity. Glazer's zone of interest exposes the generative fascism of current ethos within the shared, over-communicative, panderingly decorative social media afflictions, the aesthetic of Wes Anderson's influence, if nothing else, whereas Wenders' Perfect Days presents an ambivalent operating system and opts to follow a glass-half-full embodiment protagonist subject, Hirayama, and an audience must decide whether modernity was worth it, a reason for continual celebration, or an indictment of either human progress or the idea that life has any meaning behind biological, Skinnerian, neuron-firing pointlessness. Like Jarmusch's Patterson, without the same contempt for humanity or bizarre bemusement at human disappointment and suffering and miseries, that's Americans for you, Perfect Days doesn't deny any claims that life could be mundane, but insists that one can do more with it, whilst acting non-judgmental of those who don't, Hirayama, or perhaps more accurately, haven't yet. The door is open, narratively, for Hirayama to find some more traditional, still rooted in biological determinism, albeit human solace, and yet there is also room for him to stay stagnant if it makes him happier, and for the audience to decide, based on Hirayama's circumstances, their verdict on our current human modernity. With the ubiquity of the internet, echo chambers can be constructed as easily as ever, but also shattered as easily as ever. Every major thinker or theorem or philosophy one can find tarnished and ridiculed online. This isn't the 90s anymore, wherein one Sartre phase could go unmocked if they simply didn't tell anyone about it until you had a guaranteed record deal. And so a choice between progressive optimism, spiritual zen, doomerist nihilism, and self-induced satisfaction are at tense odds with each other in our minds and via cultural struggle for control of the internet's discourse. Perfect Days is the consummate feature film along with Glazer's Zone of Interest, wherein 2023 can be assessed, examined, and either lauded or condemned, or treated with indifference, or dismissed. Let's stress the importance of Japan again. The modern developed nation which has been the least welcoming to current cultural globalization, and yet one which many envision as a near-futuristic quasi-ideal for the rest of the globe to enviably imitate. An emphasis on abundant entertainment, social activities, and technological experiments is part of how Japan is perceived in the Western world. To display an outsider's take on it, as Wenders had America during his 1970s output, though Wenders really got America, many traditional American distillations were inherently the perspectives of, well, immigrants, including the settlers, founders, and their closer descendants. Consider the recent depictions of Japan from Wenders or Kiarostami to be closer to how Kubrick or Ang Lee depicted England in Barry Lyndon and Sense and Sensibility respectively, not England as a mundane home, but as an ideal operating system, perhaps rooted in myths and a romanticization/fetishization of England from wishful thinking Anglophiles, but their ideals arose from somewhere or something. There was an essence to English history at one time which spurred any artistic influence it bestowed as Japan upon artists like Wenders and or Kiarostami. Perfect Days has typified a modernity as we know it. Now maybe we might move on to the next skin of our contemporary. Whatever it may look like to us, it too will eventually feel mundane if we're not careful with its aesthetic and our perception thus of it.